Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
During my own promotion dinner, my father lifted his glass with theatrical cheer, leaned back so the leather banquette side under him, and announced for the benefit of the entire restaurant, including the neighboring table where a couple pretended not to listen, that his real star was my sister and that it was a crying shame she could not be there to show everyone how achievement is supposed to look, and I swear I felt the word "supposed" scrape along my ribs like a bottle opener because we have been rehearsing the scene since middle school science fairs and college acceptance letters and every Christmas where my gifts were practical while hers sparkled. I smiled the way women smile when they are expected to keep a room from boiling over, let the laughter flutter around the table like paper streamers, and reached for the chilled water because the bubbles in the champagne were going to turn my tongue reckless if I did not pace myself. While my mother clucked about parking being impossible near this place, and my father recounted a slightly polished version of my sister's latest triumphs, none of which had been verified by anyone with a keyboard or a calendar, and my coworkers, who know how office politics ferment under family expectations, performed those careful corporate faces that say congratulations and also poor you. My boss, Carter, had chosen this steakhouse with its framed photographs of athletes and stern judges because he believes in symbolism, and he let the waiters orbit us with heavy plates and measured compliments while he spoke only when necessary, which is his favorite way to apply pressure, and I wondered whether he could feel the undertow of the evening pulling me back toward a shoreline I promised myself I was done visiting, the one where I am the sensible daughter with the neat resume, the one who takes the late train and the early meeting, the one whose wins are housekeeping while my sisters are fireworks. When the ribeye arrived for my father and the sea bass for my mother and some delicate tower of roasted vegetables for me, because I had the kind of week where red meat felt like a dare, my father raised his glass again, insisted that Carter say something on the record, and nodded at me like I was a baton he had just placed in the hand of a relay runner who would obviously deliver it to my sister at the finish line. So I dabbed my napkin and arranged my face into the expression that photographs as gracious, and said I was grateful for the team, grateful for the messy work that never makes the highlight reel, and grateful for the people who taught me to keep going when applause was not guaranteed, which is the most honest thing I had said at a family table in years. Carter cleared his throat, smiled in a way that told me he was calibrating the room rather than enjoying it, and said I had earned the role the hard way, not by having the loudest story, but by hauling the heaviest load. A line that made my mother lower her fork and my father perform a small theatrical scoff, as if hard work were cute, but not the main event. And I could feel the heat rising into my cheeks, because I should have felt purely proud, but the old script was clanging in the background, like pots in a sink, and the ridiculous part is that I wanted to protect everyone from the noise, even though I had been the one standing over that sink for years. I decided, in that quiet, private place where useful decisions are born, to give myself a small revenge with the elegance of a paper cut, so when the server asked about dessert I suggested the celebratory sampler, the one that arrives with sparklers and a little brass bell, and when my father waved a dismissive hand and barked that we did not need theatrics, I said warmly that tonight we absolutely did, and that if the restaurant had a microphone I would borrow it, because tonight was about the person who showed up, put in the hours, and kept the lights on, and I clinked my glass to my own promotion with such gentle certainty that the neighboring couple actually applauded, which painted the slightest blush of irritation on my father's temples, and made my mother adjust her necklace the way she does when she wants to reset a scene. The sparklers hissed and threw light across the table like tiny cameras, the bell tinkled, and I leaned toward my father and, with the softest voice I could manage, thanked him for coming to celebrate me even though I knew it must be difficult to attend an event where his favorite child was not the headliner, which landed like a feather and also like a brick because he chuckled too quickly and reached for his water and told me not to take things so personally, then squeezed my shoulder exactly the way coaches squeeze shoulders when they are actually saying sit down. Carter, who notices everything and spends words like currency, watched this exchange with the bored attention of a cat in a sunbeam, then turned to my father and, as if commenting on the weather, said that it was interesting he brought up my sister because she had visited his office that morning and that he could not discuss details, but that her employment status had changed, at which point my father, who had been inflating like a parade balloon all evening, laughed and asked whether Carter had offered her a better title because the kid always lands on her feet, and Carter leaned back, folded his hands, and said that he had fired her. The word fired left his mouth like a door slamming in an empty house, and the table swallowed a silence so complete that I heard the ice crack inside my glass, and my mother's hand went to her throat as if a necklace had tightened. And my father's smile collapsed like a tent in bad weather, one pole at a time, while I sat very still with a pleasant, professional expression because I have learned not to rush into other people's shocks, even when they belong to me, and into that breathless pause. The server placed the checkbook that I had quietly requested earlier, embossed leather gleaming, which I slid toward my father with a sweetness that tasted like victory and said, for the sake of tradition, that the head of the family should pick up the bill tonight. To which he did not respond, because his phone had begun to buzz on the table, my sister's name filling the screen like a siren. The screen lit the linen like a flare, and my father, who is usually theatrical about silencing his phone in restaurants as if he were a senator at a hearing, stared at my sister's name without touching it, eyes narrowing, throat working, while my mother's lips formed a small sorry that wasn't for me so much as for the public embarrassment of having bragged about one daughter while the other was quietly sinking, and I kept my posture tall and my voice even because nothing ruins a promotion quite like turning it into crisis management for a family that has always expected me to be the designated driver for their bad decisions. Carter took a measured sip of his drink, the kind of slow, neutral gesture that says boundaries are not negotiable, then laid his napkin beside his plate and said he was stepping out to take a quick call, which I knew was less about talking to anyone and more about giving my family enough air to decide whether they were going to melt down or man up in front of my colleagues. And as he moved away, the table suddenly felt like a stage after the director has left the room. Everyone testing lines that might save face without surrendering control, while I folded my hands and waited because, for once, silence worked for me. My father cleared his throat and said there must be some mistake, that Carter was probably using exaggerated language because corporate types love to dramatize things they cannot fix, then asked me, almost jovially, whether this was some kind of joke. A hazing ritual to make the night memorable, which would have been funny if it weren't so exhausting, and in the space where I might have rushed to soften the blow, I chose a different script and told him that if there was a misunderstanding he could sort it out after dessert since, tonight, the only confirmed fact was that I had earned a new title and he had a bill to handle. A line that earned a choked laugh from one of my coworkers and a mortified glance from my mother, who hates when the private hierarchy is acknowledged in public. The phone buzzed again, this time with a new message, the preview flashing a plea that sounded more like a command, "We need to talk tonight," and for a moment the old reflex warmed my palm, that automatic reach to fix, to mediate, to become the walking airbag between my sister's chaos and the people she injures. But I set the device screen down and asked the server for coffee, then asked for it again because I wanted the repetition to land like a drumbeat that said I am not moving, not pivoting, not abandoning my own night to mop up someone else's, and when the cups arrived I poured cream in a thin ribbon and said, conversationally, that it was wild how quiet a room gets when the story people told about you meets a fact it cannot digest. For years my father has narrated my life like a polite footnote under my sister's headline, the sensible daughter, the dependable one, the girl who never needed rescue because she had the good sense to avoid trouble. And I used to tell myself that being known for reliability was a kind of crown until I realized it also makes you the castle wall, expected to absorb every impact without cracking, so I decided, right there, to chip a little stone back in my direction. Small enough to pass us manners, sharp enough to draw blood, and I raised my cup and toasted the table with a thank you to everyone who showed up, because showing up is the opposite of magical thinking. Then looked directly at my father and added that some of us learned early that attention is not love and applause is not protection, which made him blink as if I had switched the lighting. Carter returned, settled, and, with the same calm that had detonated the evening 5 minutes earlier, told my father that there was no misunderstanding and that employment decisions are handled with documentation and witnesses. And while he would not share details, he could say with confidence that the situation was final and that the best thing any of us could do was not to interfere, and my mother whispered that perhaps my sister had been unfairly targeted because young women can be misunderstood in certain offices, at which point I felt the familiar tug toward advocacy rise in my chest like a tide and then, blessedly, recede because I remembered every time I had played defense for a person who never stood defense for me. Revenge did not need fireworks, it needed precision, so I excused myself with a smile, carried my phone to the host's stand, and asked the manager, a woman with the dry wit of someone who has witnessed every variety of human theater, whether the little brass bell could be rung one more time, not for dessert, but for a toast to what we value when the script goes sideways, and when she obliged I returned to the table and, as the bell chimed, thanked my team for promoting competence over spectacle, consistency over gossip, and results over story, then added, lightly enough to pass for humor, that I hoped our families would take notes since the office already had, a line that caused a soft ripple of laughter and an unmistakable clench along my father's jaw, which is the currency I had come to collect. The check arrived with deliberate ceremony, and I watched my father reach for it with a rigid smile, sign with a pen stroke that pressed so hard the paper dented, then stand as if fresh air might fix what the room had done to certainty. And while my mother fussed with her wrap, I slipped my phone from the table because the screen had bloomed again with my sister's name and a string of messages that alternated between accusation and desperation, the last one reading that Carter had lied and that there were things I did not know, that I needed to meet her in the lot behind the riverfront garage right now, and while every practical cell in my body advised me to go home, lock the door, and soak in my win, I heard myself tell Carter that I would catch up tomorrow and tell my parents to drive safe, then walked into the cooling night where the streetlights threw long, patient shadows and my sister's pin pulsed on the map like a heartbeat I had promised myself I would stop chasing years ago. The night air had a crispness that made the city lights shimmer against the wet asphalt, reflecting 1,000 little stories I did not have the patience to untangle. And I found myself waiting in the shadow of a brick wall near the parking garage where the echoes of my heels were the only audience for the tension building inside me, while my sister arrived in a black sedan, windows tinted, engine still warm, and stepped out with that practiced glare that always convinced people she knew everything before anyone else even had a clue, which made me wonder whether she believed it herself or if it was merely the armor she had learned to wear at birth. Her first words cut through the silence like a scalpel, the kind that doesn't leave marks on the skin but leaves a bruise on your confidence, and she demanded to know why I had done what I did with Carter, as if the firing of her position could be pinned on my invisible hands, and I listened carefully, letting the anger pour from her like a waterfall into a pond I had been pretending to fish in, noting the tremor in her voice that betrayed a fear she refused to name, while I sipped the coffee I had brought in a thermos and reminded myself that revenge is a slow, deliberate art that thrives in patience, not hasty gestures. She paced the concrete with the precision of a dancer and spoke of promises made by my father, of whispered assurances from people in offices that I could not name, as if my life had been nothing but a backdrop to her narrative of entitlement. And I kept my expression neutral, because neutral is a currency I have been trading in since childhood, and the more she accused, the more I understood that the sister I had grown up believing to be untouchable was, in fact, fraying at the edges, that the carefully constructed stage she had performed upon was built on assumptions and lies, and I realized for the first time that her collapse could be exquisite if handled with the correct combination of silence and subtlety. I finally spoke, letting my voice be measured, even and low enough to pull her attention without raising alarm, and told her that I had no control over the decisions made in offices she thinks she owns, that the only reality I dealt with was my own, and that if she wanted to pin blame, she should look in the mirror, not across a table where the consequences of her actions had finally caught up with her, and I watched her eyes narrow, the fire in them burning with frustration, disbelief, and an unwillingness to accept that the world is indifferent to anyone's sense of right, which made me feel a satisfaction that was not cruel, but precise, like setting a chessboard in a corner where only the intended player notices the placement. She leaned in, lowering her voice, her words almost a whisper, but carrying the weight of all our childhood competitions, and said she would make sure that Carter regretted what he did, that she had allies and promises and strategies I could not anticipate. And for a moment I considered the paths she could take, the chaos she could unleash, and understood that the stakes were not just her career or my satisfaction, but the fragile illusion of control we both pretend to maintain when the rest of the world is unpredictable and merciless, and I let her believe that I feared nothing when, in fact, I was cataloging every detail, every misstep, every overconfidence she offered me freely like currency. Then she did something I had not expected. She lowered her gaze, almost vulnerably, and said, in a voice that I recognized as the same one she used to whisper in our shared bedroom when she thought no one was listening, that I may have won this round. But there are things she had learned from our father, from people in power, from moments I did not witness, and that someday I would understand the depth of what she was capable of, a statement heavy with threat and promise intertwined so tightly that it felt like a cord around my chest, and I simply nodded, holding the thermos between my hands, because acknowledgement is different from concession, and she had offered me the chance to collect information without giving her leverage, which I did not waste. The night stretched around us like a canvas, the sounds of distant traffic punctuating our standoff, and when she finally turned and walked back to her car, I felt the electric hum of anticipation in my veins. Knowing that the game had shifted, but the pieces were still in motion, that my silence had planted seeds of paranoia, and that when she looked back from the driver's seat, expecting fury or remorse, she would see only composure. The quiet intensity of someone who has survived the margins for years and now stands at the center, capable of steering outcomes without announcing intentions, leaving me alone in the lot with the faint scent of exhaust and coffee, knowing that the next move would reveal not just her desperation, but the true measure of how far she was willing to go and how completely she underestimated the consequences of the past catching up with her. The week that followed unfolded like a chess match played on shifting ground, where every conversation, every glance, every casual mention of my sister carried hidden weight, and I moved carefully through the office corridors with the awareness that everyone knew something, that gossip was no longer rumor but currency, and that the subtle decay of her credibility was spreading in ways I could only observe with the patience of someone accustomed to slow victories. The whispers began softly, floating from cubicle to cubicle, as colleagues exchanged news filtered through the lenses of office politics, and I could hear fragments of sentences, caught between curiosity and judgment, about a failed project, an inappropriate approach to clients, and, most devastatingly, attempts to leverage relationships for personal gain, all painted with enough vagueness to preserve plausible deniability yet precise enough to carve doubt into her reputation, and I watched. As always, without betraying emotion, cataloging the impact of each syllable on the perceptions of those who matter. Meanwhile, my father maintained his theatrical composure at home, defending my sister with the same fervor he had used to dismiss my accomplishments for years, insisting that she was misunderstood, that her brilliance was ahead of its time, and that I was insensitive for failing to intervene, and I let him speak because confrontation was a luxury I could afford once the facts aligned with strategy, and because the smallest of victories is sweetest when it leaves the opponent fully confident they are still in control. I attended meetings, spoke with clients, and drafted reports with the same meticulous attention to detail I had cultivated over the years, all the while observing the subtle cracks forming in the professional world my sister had once dominated with ease. And the realization struck me with an understated satisfaction that the very mechanisms she had used to climb were now the ones that ensnared her, that her reliance on charm over substance, on connections over competence, had produced an outcome as inevitable as it was elegant, though I remained careful not to gloat, understanding that patience is amplified by restraint. One afternoon, as I lingered near the reception, a whispered comment from a junior analyst confirmed the worst of her miscalculations. She had attempted to redirect sensitive client information. A maneuver meant to assert influence, but executed with a recklessness that left a trail of documentation visible to multiple managers, and I felt the subtle thrill of justice tempered by the knowledge that exposure does not require intervention, only observation, and that timing is the ultimate arbiter of outcomes when human error aligns with opportunity. At home, the tension between appearances and reality became unbearable for my father, whose belief in my sister's invincibility blinded him to the mounting evidence, and when he questioned me directly, seeking reassurance, I offered only careful neutrality, reminding him that I cannot control the decisions of others and that accountability is best handled where authority resides, which was a truth he could neither dismiss nor fully embrace, leaving him with a growing sense of unease that I recognized with quiet satisfaction. The evening of the next family gathering arrived, and my sister made her entrance with a calculated smile and an aura of confidence she hoped would obscure her vulnerabilities, but the room was no longer receptive to performance alone. My father's gaze flickered with uncertainty, my mother's expressions betrayed concern, and the murmurs among extended relatives reflected a subtle but undeniable shift, a collective awareness that the narrative of superiority she had long relied upon was under siege, and I observed all of it, knowing that the most effective revenge is that which unfolds without force, appearing only as consequence. In the corner of the room, I noticed Carter's presence, which my sister had not anticipated, and the recognition in her eyes was almost imperceptible, the flash of dread and calculation passing so quickly that most would have missed it. But I saw it clearly, understanding that her attempts to manipulate professional relationships were now intersecting with the very personal networks she had underestimated, and that the delicate balance she relied upon was tipping irrevocably in my favor, leaving me to orchestrate the final acts of exposure with precision and patience. I approached the dessert table, noting the intricate arrangement of pastries and the faint aroma of chocolate and almonds, and allowed the conversation to drift naturally toward her recent office conduct, subtly letting details emerge that, while true, were presented in a manner that amplified perception without exaggeration, and I watched the effect ripple through her carefully constructed composure as she shifted uneasily, her smile now thin and tight, while my father's voice faltered for the first time in years, revealing that the illusion of invulnerability had been shattered, and I realized that the evening would conclude with a revelation she could neither prevent nor fully control. By the time the family dispersed, she had left with a smile that was brittle, a polite exit masking the storm within, and I remained, quietly savoring the knowledge that her re-entry into professional circles would now be measured by a scrutiny she had never encountered before, and that my decision to observe, rather than intervene, had ensured that her missteps were documented in memory as well as reputation, leaving me with a satisfaction that was complete in its subtlety, an elegant vengeance that required no dramatics, only the steady unfolding of truth. The tension that had been quietly accumulating for weeks reached a crescendo the moment my sister entered the room, her presence no longer commanding but calculated, as if every step and glance were part of a strategy she hoped would salvage what remained of her dignity, and I watched from the corner with a patience born of long practice, noting how the air shifted around her, how my father straightened instinctively, and how my mother's expression betrayed the conflict between maternal instinct and the undeniable evidence that her favored child had faltered spectacularly. She approached Carter with the same familiarity she had relied on for years, a smile that was meant to disarm, gestures that were meant to charm, and words carefully rehearsed to suggest loyalty and confidence. Yet the subtle hesitation in her eyes revealed a fracture she could not disguise, and I recognized immediately that her attempt to leverage personal influence against professional accountability was doomed. For the same structures she had underestimated were now alert, meticulous, and ready to document every misstep, while I remained quiet, letting the inevitability of consequence unfold without interference, a masterful observer of her unraveling. My father, still clinging to the notion that my sister's brilliance was untouchable, interjected with an enthusiasm that was almost desperate, attempting to reassert control over a narrative that had already slipped from his hands. Yet the balance of power had shifted irreversibly, and I watched the subtle faltering in his posture, the quick glance to my mother for reassurance, the faint tremor in his voice, knowing that the carefully maintained illusion of familial hierarchy was collapsing. Under the weight of truth and consequence, while I remained composed, a silent arbiter of the fallout. As the evening progressed, I subtly guided conversations toward the professional missteps my sister had made, allowing colleagues and family members alike to piece together the sequence of errors and misjudgments that had led to her dismissal. And I observed the discomfort in her expressions, the thin veneer of confidence cracking in real time, while my father's attempts to defend her became increasingly strained, each argument revealing more about his inability to protect her than about her actual competence, and I realized that the satisfaction of this particular revenge lay not in confrontation, but in letting reality speak louder than words. When my sister, in a final attempt to salvage the evening, leaned close to Carter to whisper assurances and promises, I noted the subtle recognition in his posture, the polite but firm disengagement that communicated authority without insult. And I felt a quiet triumph as the balance of power, previously skewed in her favor, now rested entirely with those whose judgment and authority mattered, while my father's eyes followed the interaction with disbelief and dawning comprehension, the first true acknowledgement that his favored child was no longer invincible, and that the consequences of choices ignored had arrived with precision. The evening's climax arrived with a simple question from a cousin, asked in casual curiosity, but striking at the heart of accumulated tension, about whether my sister's current projects were meeting expectations, and I allowed a pause to stretch, letting the room fill with the unspoken awareness that the narrative of competence and entitlement had shifted irreversibly, and when I finally spoke, I did so with measured calm, recounting details that were factual, undeniable, and unembellished. Each statement carrying the weight of authority without a trace of malice, leaving my sister to absorb the judgment of the room in silence, a silence I allowed to expand and echo as a mirror to her failures. My father attempted to intervene one last time, a desperate effort to redirect attention, to reclaim control, yet the attempt fell flat as the subtle reality of exposure and accountability rendered his words ineffective. And I observed with quiet precision how his theatrical confidence had been replaced with uncertainty, a rare vulnerability laid bare in front of our peers, and I understood that the most complete revenge is the one that reveals the truth without embellishment, allowing pride to erode naturally in the face of facts, while I remained unshaken, composed, and fully aware of the culmination of weeks of observation and restraint. When my sister finally left, her steps measured, but the smile brittle, my father followed with a gaze heavy with confusion and dawning regret, while my mother lingered, caught between sympathy and acknowledgement. And I allowed the room to settle into an uneasy equilibrium, the tension diffused, but the lesson indelibly impressed upon all present, leaving the air charged with questions that could not yet be answered, and as I exhaled, feeling the subtle satisfaction of a plan executed with patience and precision, I realized that the story had not ended, that the ambiguity of what my sister might attempt next and the faint, unspoken promises she carried would linger in the minds of everyone present, and that some truths, carefully orchestrated, are most powerful when they remain unresolved, echoing silently in the spaces where expectation and consequence intersect.